Greetings once again to you. This is Tony Denton from the Phoenix, Arizona area on this second day of May, 2018 around 11 a.m. It's a really nice day today. It's only 69 degrees right now, which is a little unusual, and I'm enjoying it, of course. I want to share with you some more thoughts about this evil business. In fact, before you even listen to this or read the notes to this PDF, which you can find on my website, asightforthelord.com, I ask you to go back and check out my talk on Satan in the Old Testament first. If you've not done that, please do that, and it will help a little bit with how you perceive this one, because I'm not going to repeat a lot of the information that's found in that one, which sets it up for us today. Anyway, today we're going to spend our time mainly on devils or demons in the New Testament. In the Hebrew, there are no cases of devil singular in the Old Testament, but there are 4 cases in which devils or demons plural are found from 2 terms in the Old Testament. One of them is shed, S-H-E-D, which is Strong's number 7700 if you want to look it up that way, meaning a demon or devil as used in Deuteronomy 32:17 and Psalm 106:37, again, plural, not singular. Also, there's the word Sair, which is S-A-I-R, pronounced Sair. That's Strong's number 8163. A he or hairy goat. A devil is how that's defined. Leviticus 17:7 and 2 Chronicles 11 verse 15 for examples. It's the same term as used of Esau, who was a hairy man. So he, in a sense, was referred to as a goat or a devil in that sense, but it's related to that very concept of being hairy. This term is from should, S-H-O-O-D, referring to a tempestuous storm, devastation, or waste. So in other words, Sair is related to should. Again, waste, devastation, etc. So the terms devils or demons in the Old Testament was always used in reference to idol worship. Idols such as in the form of goats, and the devastating consequences such would bring upon those worshipers at the hand of the one true God. Go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 32, the whole chapter, because it will help you a lot with understanding the ideology about devils or demons and goats and idols and all that stuff. Now, to the Greek. Devil or demon and devils, demons, are used numerous times in the New Testament, translated from 2 main words, diabolos or diabolos, which is Strong's number 1228, from which we get our term diabolical. Strong says this word refers to a false accuser, devil, or slanderer. This was the Greek term chosen by the Septuagint in Numbers 22:22 and Psalm 71:13 for Satan. And then the second Greek word is daimon, or daimon, which is Strong's number 1142, from which we get our term demon. And it's a term used in Acts 17:18 of idols. Okay? Keep that in mind as well. So we looked at the Hebrew for devils or demons, and it's found in Deuteronomy 32, where it's talked about in reference to idols and idol worship. In the Greek, we have daimon, which is also used in reference to idols in Acts 17. So keep those things in mind, because we're going to talk about demon possession. So as we just touched on, Israel couldn't seem to avoid getting involved in the worship of demons, devils, gods, or idols according to passages like Deuteronomy 32:17 and context. Okay? Kind of keep that concept in mind that demons were idols. Idols were referred to as demons. And due to rebellion and idolatrous waywardness, God delineated numerous curses that would be visited upon them for such insolence and disrespect for Him. In Deuteronomy 28, verse 28, and verse 35, and verse 65, for examples among various physical punishments, Moses, via inspiration, said to the people that the Lord will strike you with madness, blindness, confusion of heart, and so on. He will strike you in the knees and on the legs, and so on. He will give you an anxious heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul, and so on. Again, that's Deuteronomy 28, 35, and 65. Okay, see here we have so far the very concept that demons were actually idols, or idols were referred to as demons. And if they continue to worship idols, that is, disrespecting God by putting idols in His place, then God was going to strike them with these things we just enumerated. Madness, blindness, confusion, strike them in their knees and in their legs, and He'd give them anxiety of heart and failing eyes and anxiety of soul, and so on. Okay? Now, but Isaiah 35, verses 5 through 6, for one prophetic example, predicted that when the Messiah came, the eyes of the blind would be open, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. Now, I want you to take Isaiah 35, 5 and 6, and pit it against Deuteronomy 28, 35, and 65, and see if you don't see a contrast. What God would strike them with due to the idolatry, that is just talking about corporate Israel in general over their lifetime as God's old covenant people. They would receive these negative sicknesses, these physical and sicknesses of the mind because of their idolatry. But, Isaiah prophesied, when the Messiah comes, He will give the blind back their sight, give the deaf their hearing, help those who have been struck in the knees and the legs to leap like deers, and let the dumb speak again or sing. Okay, now, I think that in itself ought to be very helpful in getting into what we're going to be talking about here. So, when John the Baptizer sent two of his disciples to ask Jesus about His being the Messiah, isn't this exactly to what Jesus referred when He replied by saying, "Go and tell John the things which you see and hear. The blind see and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear." Matthew 11, 4 and 5. Isn't Jesus referring to Isaiah 35? How He's come to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah 35, which would fix the problems involved in Deuteronomy 28 as well as Deuteronomy 32? And aren't such things the very stuff He was talking about when He said to some Jewish leaders in Matthew 16:3, "You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. Don't you see what I'm doing? You guys have been involved in all this idolatry, and God's been making you sick over this, just like He promised He would. I've come along as a sign that God has shown up now, and He's going to fulfill all things in me." That's Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And I'm showing you that this is happening by fulfilling Isaiah 35. Healing people of these sicknesses, because the time has come. Something interesting I read by one writer is this. Based on his belief that demon possession is another way of referring to the curses of God upon His people for idol worship per Deuteronomy 28 and 32, he wrote, "Let it be noted that the language of demons is associated with illness, not sin. We don't read of Christ casting out demons of envy, demons of murder, etc. It must also be noted that the Bible speaks of people having a demon or a disease, rather than saying that demons caused the disease." That's from Duncan Heister in his book called The Real Devil, page 197. In Psalm 106, verses 36 through 39, it says that Israel served Canaanite idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons when they sacrificed to those idols. Thus they were defiled by their own works and played the harlot by their own deeds. So Israel's worship of demons was described by God as worshiping their own works, their own deeds, because their belief in demons was a result of human imagination. In fact, the term for idols literally means no things, stressing that they have no existence outside of man's imagination. And what do we imagine? We imagine the things that have been pictured in paintings and drawings and movies and so on of demons. These esoteric, metaphysical, mystical beings, these ugly, red, flaming horns and stuff like you see with Satan. We know what demons look like because of movies and such. That's the imagination of man. And it's said in Psalm 102, it's the imaginations. It's what men, by using the word idols, what has been conjured up in the minds of men. Perhaps that's one reason why God forbade the concept of even making something that they thought God looked like. God did not want them using their imaginations, does not want us using our imaginations, to create what we believe God looks like. God is spirit. He doesn't look like anything. But man has this desire, for some reason, to create something tangible, physical, earth-like, or we would call it non-earth-like, non-earthly, or unearthly, to worship something that's tangible instead of abstract and spirit. And so Deuteronomy 32, 15 through 24 came into the picture. In a passage dealing with God's anger with such matters, we read God saying that Israel provoked me by what is not God. Again, remember, an idol is no thing. Why is it no thing? Because it is an imaginary thing, not real. That's what an idol is. And that not real thing became known as a demon. That's the word used to describe it, to name it. The Septuagint of Isaiah 65 verse 3 says that demons do not exist. And 1 Samuel 12:21 says that they are nothing. No thing. Nothing. Jeremiah 14 verse 4. You might want to check that out as well. Although at this time I don't have all the answers to every single little passage and every question that might come up because there's so much in the Bible about all of this, based on this information and a lot of other stuff that I don't have time to share, I am much more open to the idea that demon possession wasn't actually a person's body being literally overcome by some metaphysical being. Rather, it seems to be nearly an overwhelming possibility that those referred to as demon-possessed were actually suffering the curses of God predicted in Deuteronomy 28 and following. Just read it all the way through chapter 32. You'll see bits and pieces about all this kind of stuff. So, let's look at demons now as idols. Idols were simply demons. Demons were idols. The idol represented nothing. Something that was of man's imagination. The idol was the tangible representation of that imagination, however ugly that thing might have been that they imagined. To them, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, whatever they imagined wasn't ugly to them, as it tends to be with us. Whatever the case is, just keep in mind, demons were idols, idols were demons. And again, even Paul referred to that concept in Acts chapter 17 that I mentioned earlier. Earlier we touched on how that the Bible equates demons with idols, back in Deuteronomy and so on. Well, let's focus now on that just a little more by first of all establishing the Bible's teaching about Yahweh as being the source of all power. Isaiah 45 verse 5 has God saying, I am the Lord. There is no other. There is no God besides me. And I'm told that the Hebrew term used for God essentially means power. That is, there is no power outside of me. For there to be a power, there has to be something in existence. There is nothing else in existence. God is the only power. Which goes along with my last talk on Satan in the Old Testament that I mentioned to you at the very beginning. Not only are my PDF notes on my website, asightforthelord.com, for what I'm going through right now, but there's also that lesson, which establishes that there was never any old covenant, any concept of Satan being a metaphysical, supernatural, evil, wicked being. He was always either God or an agent of God or a personification of a people who were an enemy. See, just like with a lot of other words, if translators had merely translated some of these words instead of transliterating them, we wouldn't have near the difficulty we do today with certain things, like the word satanos for Satan. It simply means enemy. If they had translated it enemy, do you think we'd have near the problems we have now? Because then you'd know to look in the context to see what the enemy was. What was the enemy of the context? The same thing with this concept. Instead of translating things the way they did, like diabolos is another word for enemy or adversary of some sort, an accuser or something along those lines. But instead, you got to have this mysticism and mystical stuff going on, and they insist on transliterating it. So, this must be this thing or that thing, that you imagine in your mind. Instead of just making it a word, translating it into a regular word in another language. Anyway, this teaching about God being the only power outside of us, this teaching is found over and over again in the Old Testament. Isaiah 44:8, Deuteronomy 4 verse 35, etc. And this is why God is jealous when his people believe in other gods or powers outside of him, especially if they're opposite of him. If they depict some characteristic that isn't his. What's worse is that his people are worshiping something that's literally nothing. This reminds me of a scenario that I have heard sometimes. A wife discovers her husband has been running around on her. When she approaches him, he says, "But she means nothing to me." To this, the wife gets even more irate because he, thinking he had a decent reply, is then asked, "So you ran around on me with someone who doesn't mean anything to you? I'd actually feel better about it if she meant something to you." So, that's a great reply by her. She puts him in his place. Think about that with reference to what we're talking about now with God, and how he would feel, and how he did feel, and why he said the things he did, and why he put upon them the curses he did. In Bible times, because they believed entities outside of God were the cause of tragedies, and so on, people believed demons to be lesser gods who could be worshipped to stop problems coming in their lives. So they made models to represent them and through which to appease them, explaining why Paul used the term demons and idols interchangeably. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 20 and verse 28. Check it out. Demons and idols, interchangeable. 1 Corinthians 10, 20 and 28. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 8 verse 4, "An idol, or demon, is nothing, no thing. There is no other God but one." In other words, an idol or a demon has no existence at all. Okay, that fits right in with what we studied in the last study on Satan in the Old Testament, where it's very clear that Satan is not and was never considered by them during the Old Covenant times. The people of God did not consider Satan to be a supernatural evil being. Just like an idol. An idol is nothing. There is no other God but God. But if there is the supernatural evil being, then you have another God. Whether it's lesser God or not. God says there is no other God. He then went on to say, Paul did, even if there are so-called gods, yet for us there is only one God, of whom are all things. If God is not with them or in them, then they cannot have existence. These other so-called gods, these imaginary things that man has come up with, do not give any existence to anything or anyone because they don't even exist. Now this corresponds with some passages in the Psalms which speaks of idols or demons if they exist. Psalm 29, 1 and 2 and verse 10 and Psalm 97 verse 78. I just have too much here to go through every passage, but you can look those up. In other words, demons and such no more truly exist in some realm than the mythical gods of the Greeks. Okay, we've talked about devils or demons here and this whole demon possession concept some. And we'll get back to it, but let's talk about the serpent a little bit here first. We recently studied Genesis chapter 1 from an allegorical perspective. Well, at least I did in some other studies. Namely that it employs literal physical things and events to paint a picture of the history of God's scheme of redemption of man through Israel. And for those who have not been involved with me in my studies on Genesis chapters 1 through 3, all I'm saying is that we need to look at Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 in an allegorical perspective. Not that Adam didn't exist, not that Eve didn't exist, and so on, but that a lot of what's involved was meant to picture something the Hebrew people read and wrote and understood in pictures. Even their language, the Hebrew language like Chinese and so on, pictures, not letters and words the same way we have. Anyway, just keep that in mind for now. Anyway, we don't have time to get into all that, obviously, to set this up, but to think about the story of Genesis as being a picture of the history of God's scheme of redemption through Israel. Okay? The seventh day of the 7 days is the finished product, the Sabbath of rest being Jesus and what he would bring as Messiah. Well, likewise, I believe chapter 2 Genesis 1, going through chapter 2, verse 4, is that allegorical picture I just mentioned. I believe chapter 2 of Genesis, which began the Eden saga, was meant to teach not only a general occurrence concerning the origin of Israel, but also by employing the type-antitype method of teaching, eventual readers would recognize certain concepts via representation. For example, that this first Adam was the counterpart of the second Adam. That is, that he, in one sense, represented the coming Messiah. The tree of life also represented that Messiah. The garden represented a place where man could be in God's presence, like the most holy place, which could also be seen as the Messiah. The Messiah is now the most holy place. In him is salvation. Eve represented the bride, the church of Christ, and so on. All these things, I believe, can be found in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Now, by the way, while I believe that Adam and Eve were real people, the beginning of Israel, I'm not convinced that every other item, such as the trees and the animals and so on, in this narrative was literal. Again, that's the Hebrew way. The Hebrew way in teaching worked that way. I see Genesis chapters 2 and 3 as the writer creating sort of a mosaic for Israel to see what God did for them from the very outset and how that she was rebellious from the get-go. After all, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Genesis chapters 1 through 3 is a painting in which, as with most paintings, most of the details represent something. I know good and well, most of you in my listening audience right now have seen pictures or paintings where there are real people in the picture, yet there are things around that real person or those real people depicting things that occurred in their lives or something of that sort that were not real. Those characters or whatever those things were not literal, but they pictured something about that person or that couple or whatever. And that's the same way Genesis 1 through 3 is. The people are real because the Messiah came through their physical lineage. Yet, the things portrayed around them in that narrative were merely for the purpose of painting a picture about the history of that couple and or who they represented. The details of this story depict the sordid concepts. For examples, the plant life and the rivers depict God's physical care for Adam and Eve, while the animals, from among which Adam could not find a comparable partner, depicted the idea that God's people just aren't, or at least aren't supposed to be, complementary of one another, like oil and water. They just don't mix. God didn't want Israel mixing with the nations outside of them, and so on. So the animals with whom Adam could not find a complement or partner represented the people they were not supposed to be involved with. So, speaking of the animals and Adam, what happened in chapter 3? Yes, an animal, something representing that which is essentially at odds with Adam, as well as Eve, perhaps even due to feeling insulted that he wasn't found to be good enough for a partner, was chosen to represent a rival. Just like the animals that Adam could not partner with, this serpent is an animal, depicting something he was not supposed to have something to do with. He did not complement that animal. The animal did not complement him. They were not meant to be together. But he listens to it anyway, and he falls to it, just like Israel did to the nations when they got involved with idols. So, think about this serpent. He came after Eve, the one chosen instead. Picture this serpent and Eve there. This now an enemy decided to try to put the hurt on Adam and Eve by tempting them to do that which would put them at odds with, essentially, their husband. Who's that? God. They picture Israel. God is Israel's husband. So the serpent represents a nation opposed to God, tempting his bride to depart from him, to commit spiritual adultery. So when Adam and Eve sinned, when Israel sinned, God cast them out of his den of protection until they could be successfully brought back into right or righteous relationship with him via the Messiah who would crush the enemy of God, which is sin, and of course anything or anyone associated with it, such as those who tempt his people to sin, that is, to go astray, or would otherwise try to hurt or destroy them. The serpent of Genesis chapter 3, then, to me, is a symbol of a very despised adversary, or one who is at least supposed to be despised. Revelation 12, verse 9 says, "The great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the accuser and adversary, who deceives the whole world. In this specific case, the dragon, the accuser, the adversary, and the serpent represent the enemy of Christians, the true Israel, in the first century, who would be made up of what? Old Covenant Jews, the remnant, those who were his people. God always had a remnant, always had a few people in every generation who would stick with him through thick and thin. Whoever that remnant was at the time Jesus was on the scene, and after he died, the remnant were those who accepted Jesus as Messiah. They became true Israel because they were in him, Jesus, who was true Israel. So, the adversary of them at that time was those who rejected Jesus. They were the adversary. Just as the dragon represented Pharaoh and Egypt at one point in time against God's people, Ezekiel 29 verse 3, now here in Revelation, it's pseudo-Israel against true Israel. So there you have it. Great dragon, cast out, the serpent of old, called the accuser and adversary who deceives the whole world. What world? Their world. Their world at the time of the book of Revelation. In this specific case again, now I'm going to say it one more time, the dragon, the accuser, the adversary, and the serpent represent the enemy of Christians in the first century. That is, the old covenant Jewish people, and especially the high priests, chief priests, Sanhedrin, etc., who had rejected Jesus and were trying to kill the Christians. So just as the dragon represented Pharaoh and Egypt at one point in time against God's people, now in Revelation, pseudo-Israel is against true Israel. Now, in case it isn't clear, my point is this. I believe the serpent in Genesis 3 specifically represented the enemy of the Israelites. That is, the non-Israelites who constantly tempted them to sin against their God by committing spiritual adultery with them politically and in idolatrous worship. And of course, that would include the ones who were Israelites who ended up accepting what the non-Israelites had tempted them with. And usually the leaders were those against whom God was constantly ranting throughout the prophets. He was blaming the leaders for leading most of his people Israel away. And for such, God divorced them. The northern 10 tribes around 700 BC were divorced and he cut them down. The southern 2 tribes of AD 70 were cut down, at which time the Messiah established true full righteousness via the remnant and then with all who wished and still wish to ally themselves with God. Okay, let's get back to demons now a little bit more. And in relation to the concept of sickness that I brought up earlier in Deuteronomy 28 and its connection with the idols of Deuteronomy 32, we should find it interesting, to say the least, that a Mr. G. Lamsa, a scholar who grew up around and knew very well the Aramaic language, the language we're told Jesus spoke, wrote that the phrase cast out in Aramaic means to restore to sanity or to remove the cause that produced sanity. I'm going to say it again now. He said that in the Aramaic language, which Jesus spoke, that the phrase cast out means to restore to sanity or remove the cause that produces the insanity, such as the trichina parasite, which we'll come back to in a little bit. See, from what I've read in my research, it was the language of the day to say that any disease which couldn't be understood was the fault of demons. One G.P. Gilmore said, so far as the first century populace was concerned, any disease involving mental disturbance, delirium, or spasms was attributed to demons, believed to swarm in the air. So, to say that demons were cast out of someone was to say that he or she was cured of a mental illness or a sickness which wasn't understood in their time. The association between maladies and demons is seen in Matthew chapter 8, verses 16 to 17, where it says, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. He cast out the spirits with a word, healing all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah. He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses, not demons. Likewise, when we read Acts 8 verse 7 of unclean spirits crying out, the Eastern Aramaic text interestingly reads, many who were mentally afflicted cried out. And this corresponds perfectly to Mr. G. Lamsa, also saying that unclean spirits is an Aramaic term used to describe lunatics, unquote. Even Philo commented concerning how demon-possessed people were laughed at and mocked, indicating that these folks were actually mentally ill rather than physically sick, or actually some demon-possessed thing. When Mr. Legion, in Mark chapter 5, was cured of his demons, we read of him as being in his right mind, verse 15. In other words, possession was linked to madness, which is why many said Jesus had a demon. And that takes you back to what I read earlier in the Old Testament scriptures about madness being one of the things God would afflict them with. God would afflict them with, not demons that don't even exist, because of their imaginations and worshiping their imaginations and worshiping things that represent their imaginations. So, Jesus was said to have a demon because they thought he was mad. John 10:20, John 7:19 and 20, and John 8:52. Anyway, as we already said, folks who were considered demon-possessed in those days, and even still in some places around the world today, which we'll talk about in a moment, were said to be found in their right minds once healed. Look at Luke 8:35 for another example. Implying that being demon-possessed was another way of saying that someone was mentally unhealthy, that is, not in his right mind. In fact, those possessed were said to be healed or cured, Matthew 4:24, Matthew 12:22, Matthew 17:18. When the 12 went out at the behest of Christ to heal the sick in Luke 10 verse 9, what did they come back rejoicing? They said, "Even the demons are subject to us in your name." Verse 17. Here's something else interesting. There are a lot of parallels between language used of casting out demons and that used about healings. Jesus not only rebuked demons, Mark 9:25, but he also rebuked a fever, Luke 4:39, and the wind, Matthew 8:26. Rebuked the fever, rebuked the wind. Not only were demons spoken of as being departed, Matthew 17:18, but also leprosy and other diseases were spoken of as being departed, Mark 1:42 and Acts 19:12. See, they're talking about inanimate things, things that aren't real, tangibly or physically in the sense of being some sort of a being. A wind is not a being. Fever is not a being. Demons, therefore, are not beings. Leprosy is not a being. It departed. Demons, therefore, are not beings. The same language is used. So I'd say it's more than likely that all the demons possessed of those times were actually carriers of diseases such as epilepsy and schizophrenia. Think about this. Everyone who believes demons exist must ask himself, when I'm ill, is it caused by a demon? Really? Sicknesses were directly related to demons. So, when you're sick, are you demon-possessed? If you think the New Testament references to demons are about gods going around doing evil, making you sick, then you must answer yes to that question. But in that case, how can we explain the fact that so many diseases once blamed on demons can now be cured, or at least controlled by drugs today? Malaria is a classic example. Many Africans believed until recently that malaria was caused by demons. But now they see that malaria can be cured by quinine and other drugs. Some of the diseases that Jesus cured have been identified as tetanus and epilepsy, both which can be relieved by drugs today. All right, one last thing. I'm going to go through this one because people are constantly asking about it. What about Legion and the pigs in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 17? Now I'm going to be basing my comments on this event on what we've already discussed. Namely, that the Bible uses the language of the day, speaking of things as they appeared in the eyes of the audience who viewed demons as demigods, beings with more power than mortals, but less than God, who were responsible for illnesses. And speaking of demigods, by Jesus curing illnesses as he did, he demonstrated he was not a demigod, something that even those possessed understood. Besides, a lot of what we've just talked about regarding demon possession applies here, of course. So, as we just discussed, Legion had an unclean spirit which cried out, corresponding to Acts 8 verse 7, which in Aramaic is rendered as many who were mentally afflicted cried out. Also, as just discussed, once Legion was cured of his demons, he was found in his right mind, indicating that they believed demons caused or were the force behind madness, that of which they accused Jesus, John 10:20. Furthermore, it's interesting what can be discovered by comparing parallel passages. In Mark 5 verse 7 it reads that he cried out, "Don't torment me," while in Matthew 8:29 it reads that they cried out, "Have you come to torment us?" Also in Mark 5 verse 10 it reads that he begged Jesus, while in Matthew 8:31 it reads that the demons begged Jesus. In fact, in Mark 5:9, this man's own words explain his self-perception. Notice, my name, singular, is Legion, for we are many, plural. This is classic schizophrenic behavior and language. Are you going to say that every single person today who's schizophrenic is demon-possessed? That is, possessed of some actual, literal, metaphysical being? Related to this man's own words, notice also Mark 5 verse 8, where we see Jesus saying to him, singular him, as opposed to them, to come out, casting out the sickness. It appears to me that this incident occurred when the man was actually between episodes, as it were, for he came to Jesus and worshipped him, asking if he, like others, was also going to torment or treat him badly. And Jesus responded by curing him and evidencing that cure by casting the illness into a herd of swine. Why? Perhaps because, as a Steve Keating pointed out, the madness of just such a man may have been from a brain infection of the trichina parasite commonly found infecting the muscles of pigs and contagious to humans via undercooked pork, which, by the way, Jews weren't supposed to be eating. So in other words, the guy who asked for help had been eating pork when he wasn't supposed to be. He's a Jew. Consider this, isn't it possible that this man either shepherded or even owned this very herd of swine and ate from it? If so, isn't it also possible then that when this man found himself lucid, he realized that the pig stampede wasn't only a miracle of the Lord, but also a judgment against illegal keeping and or eating of unclean animals? Now, how about a potential lesson from this incident for Israel, some members of whom were witnesses that day? Here are some thoughts along this line from a John Alfrey and an Andrew Perry. A case can be made that the man Legion was to be understood as representative of Judah in captivity, suffering for their sins, but who, like this sick man, would be healed of their sins upon repentance. So consider, Israel, like Legion, was, as God said via Isaiah, a people who sit among the graves, spend their nights in the tombs, and eat swine's flesh. Isaiah 65:3 and 4. Isaiah chapters 65 and 66 are the most messianic chapters of the entire book of Isaiah. It brings it together. It tells about how that the Messiah would bring in the entire new heavens and new earth, and the beauties of it and the perfection of it found in Christ and because of Christ and through Christ, the Messiah. Isaiah was talking about these Israelites among whom Jesus would come, that they'd be those who are sitting among graves, spending their nights in tombs, and eating swine's flesh. Literally? In some cases, probably literally. But the point is, I think that all these cases of miracles that Jesus performed were not just performance of his greatness of being able to heal somebody, but they were pictures of something as well. They were to learn something from it. Here we have this man who is picturing Israel. They need to learn from this. Also, like Legion, who was in the mountains crying out and cutting himself, Mark 5 verse 5, Israel committed their iniquitous idolatry in the hills and mountains, Isaiah 65 verse 7. Not to mention the example of how they cried out to and cut themselves for their idols, such as Baal, 1 Kings chapter 18. So the incident in Mark 5, 1 through 17, it's almost impossible, it seems to me, to not see it as being something that Jesus was doing in this case to bring to mind Isaiah 65 and how it was being fulfilled in Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And is it just coincidence that this man called himself Legion, reminiscent of Judah being under the ownership of the legions of Rome? Perhaps this legion was among and infected by pigs, so Israel was among and infected by Gentiles, and that due to their sins against their God. Further, Legion's comment that we are many is identical to the words of Ezekiel 33:24 about Israel. Son of man, they who inhabit those ruins in the land of Israel are saying, Abraham was only one, and he inherited the land, but we are many. The land has been given to us as a possession. So say to them, thus says the Lord, you eat meat with blood. you lift your eyes toward idols and shed blood, should you then possess the land? Rhetorical question. No. Lastly, for consideration, and it's probably typological event, the herd of pigs being destroyed in the water might recall the Egyptians being destroyed in the Red Sea when Israel was delivered from Gentile power before. So interestingly, the gathering Gentiles, it says, were afraid just as the Gentile world was at the time of the Exodus, Exodus 15:14. The cursing of Legion is termed great things in Mark 5:19, and Israel's exodus from Gentile power and the destruction of the Egyptians was likewise called great things, Psalm 106, verse 21. Lots of things there in that story of the Legion and the pigs and so on in Mark chapter 5. Pictures of what was happening with Jesus as the Messiah who'd come to fulfill prophecies, and how that the remnant who accepted him as the Messiah would also therefore fulfill all those positive things represented or mentioned in those great prophecies. So I don't think it's all coincidence myself. If you want to continue to think it's just coincidence, I guess you can go right ahead and do so. But I see the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, as one redemptive story. All of it is tied together, and we do disservice to it by not seeing it as being all tied together. Anyway, thank you for listening to this little study on demons and how that it's all about idols and the consequences of their idol worship, and how all of that would lead to the Messiah, and he would use all of that to prove who he was and at what time it was in the lifetime of Israel. That it was their end in the beginning of the new covenant life. I hope you come back for another one of my talks somewhere along the way. Don't forget, all these PDFs are free for reading and downloading from my website, asiteforthelord.com. That's ASITEFORTHELORD.com. And we'll catch you another time. Thanks.